In the late 19th century, Dodge City was already a name whispered with both fascination and fear. Known for its saloons, gunfights, and endless prairies, it was also home to secrets that were far darker than the legends of outlaws and sheriffs. In 1870, in the heart of this frontier town, a pair of twins were born into a family whose story had been shaped by years of silence, shame, and choices that defied morality. At first glance, they seemed like any other children of the harsh plains, fragile yet resilient. But as they grew, it became impossible to ignore the signs. Strange illnesses began to appear, physical deformities that no doctor of the time could fully explain, and a legacy of suffering that traced back through generations. What caused these terrible conditions was not just the cruelty of disease, but something rooted much deeper, hidden within the very bloodline of the family. A story of isolation, of forbidden unions, and of secrets carried for far too long. Stay with us until the end of this video as we uncover how the past of one family in Dodge City became a living nightmare for generations. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring these untold stories to light. When arriving in Dodge City in the early 1870s, the first impression was a mix of opportunity and desolation. Wooden buildings leaned against the harsh prairie winds, their boards creaking as if carrying the weight of too many winters. Dust rose with every wagon wheel, settling in thick layers over porches and windows, giving the town a permanent look of exhaustion. Life here was not easy. Survival depended on cattle drives, small crops, and a sense of community forged out of necessity. Yet, hidden behind this rugged image of the frontier was a much quieter tragedy. Just a few miles outside the noisy main street, past the saloons and the church bells that rang every Sunday, stood a ranch that looked ordinary at first sight. The house was built of rough-hewn logs, its roof patched repeatedly with whatever materials the family could afford. A barn lined sideways nearby, and the field stretched wide but barren, showing the struggle of people who had worked the same land for generations with little to show for it. The isolation was immediate. The nearest neighbor lived nearly half a mile away, and the dirt road leading to the property felt abandoned, as if few outsiders ever passed through. The family who lived there welcomed visitors with stiff politeness. Their clothes were plain, faded from the sun, and the children moved quietly, avoiding eye contact. Something about their manner hinted at more than just the fatigue of farm life. Their skin appeared pale, their features oddly similar, as though generations had etched the same traits deeper and deeper into every new face. Neighbors sometimes whispered about them in town, never loudly, but always with a certain unease. People claimed that the family kept to themselves, rarely attending church gatherings, and that the few who had done business with them noticed a strange reluctance to discuss relatives or family origins. On that first visit, what struck the observer most was not the poverty, but the silence. Inside the small house, the walls were bare except for a worn Bible and a single portrait of ancestors whose stern expressions seemed to watch over the room. Meals were simple: cornbread, beans, and little else. The children, though polite, carried a strange frailty in their movements, as though every step cost them more energy than it should. It was here, in this seemingly ordinary yet unsettling environment, that the story of the twins began. What looked like just another family enduring the unforgiving plains would soon reveal itself to be something far more disturbing. Their house, their land, even their manner of speech carried the weight of secrets buried deep in the soil of Dodge City's history. The first days spent around the family revealed details that, at a glance, might have seemed unimportant, yet slowly began to form a troubling picture. The twins, only a few months old, were fragile and restless. Their cries carried through the thin wooden walls at night, sharp and desperate, unsettling the stillness of the prairie. Their mother, though attentive, seemed worn beyond her years, her eyes heavy with something more than fatigue. She often avoided direct questions, as if she feared what might be uncovered in casual conversation. It was the children's health that drew the most concern. Their skin showed unusual pallor, their limbs frail and thin, and they seemed slow to respond to touch or sound. At a time when medical knowledge was limited and infant mortality tragically common, one could almost dismiss these symptoms as part of life on the harsh frontier. But there was something else. A strange uniformity to their appearance, not just the typical likeness of twins, but features so eerily identical that it was difficult to distinguish one from the other. Their eyes carried the same dull shade, their noses the same shape, as if nature had copied a pattern too many times, leaving no room for variation. The older children of the household, too, raised questions. Their bodies carried a stiffness, their movements awkward. One boy struggled to stand straight, his spine bent as though pressed by an invisible weight. Another child's speech was slurred, his words broken and hard to understand. In the silence of the home, these small differences stood out more sharply, creating an atmosphere that felt both sad and unsettling. The father, a stern man of few words, avoided any discussion of family history. He answered questions about the land, about cattle and weather, but if the conversation veered toward relatives or ancestry, his tone grew sharp and final. Neighbors recalled that he rarely traveled beyond town, never joined social gatherings, and always kept his children close. For them, life seemed to begin and end on that ranch. Visitors who noticed these details could not shake the feeling that the family's isolation was more than just a matter of geography. There was something deeper, an unspoken rule that bound them tightly together, keeping outsiders at a distance. The way the children looked, the way their parents avoided questions, the way silence seemed to hover in every room, all hinted at secrets waiting just beneath the surface. Whispers in Dodge City began to grow louder. Some said the children were cursed, others that disease ran in their blood. But among the most observant, the suspicion was far darker, that what plagued this family was not the work of chance or bad fortune, but the result of choices made within the walls of their own home. To understand the strange reality of the twins and their family, one had to look back at the history of Dodge City and the people who came to settle there. In the decades before the 1870s, the frontier attracted those who sought freedom, land, or simply escape from a past they wished to leave behind. Many families came together in wagon trains, forming small clusters of kin that relied on one another for survival. For some, this unity became their strength. For others, it grew into a cage. The family in question had roots that stretched back to before Dodge City even existed. Records from neighboring counties told of ancestors who had once settled near the Arkansas River, far from the bustle of town life. Unlike other settlers who eventually mingled, married into different families, and built networks, this clan chose seclusion. They married within their own circle, rarely extending ties beyond bloodlines. Over time, their world narrowed until neighbors were distant and strangers were unwelcome. Stories collected from older townsfolk hinted at a pattern. A merchant recalled that decades earlier, one of the grandfathers had brought a young bride into town who was no more than a cousin. The whispers never left, and though the community disapproved, law and distance made it difficult to interfere. A woman who lived across the prairie in the 1850s remembered the family children as being quiet, pale, and sickly, as if they carried the same shadow from birth. Even then, the same unusual likeness was remarked upon. By the time Dodge City became a thriving cattle hub, the family was already locked in its cycle of isolation. The ranch they lived on was not just their livelihood, but their prison. Generations had worked that soil, and generations had refused to leave it. Weddings took place in private, births happened without the presence of doctors, and deaths were buried on the far side of the property, marked only by crude wooden crosses that weathered away in the wind. The social context of the time made intervention unlikely. Communities valued privacy, and unless a crime was committed openly, what happened within a family's home remained unspoken. Churches preached morality, but even ministers admitted they rarely saw this family in attendance. It was easier to look away, to attribute their troubles to bad luck, than to confront the disturbing possibility of deliberate choices. By the 1870s, when the twins were born, the pattern was no longer a rumor. It had become an unbroken legacy. The illnesses and deformities that appeared were not isolated cases, but the outcome of decades of unions that ignored the boundaries set by nature and society. It was here, in this context of silence, shame, and stubborn tradition, that the suffering of the new generation began to unfold. The more time an outsider spent observing the family, the harder it became to ignore the unsettling consistencies. At first, it was simply the twins' fragile health and the older children's unusual mannerisms. But gradually, details began to align like pieces of a puzzle that nobody wished to complete. Each child bore almost identical features: the same sloping eyes, the same narrow jaws, the same pale tone of skin. Differences that usually marked individuality within siblings were absent, replaced by a strange uniformity that spoke of repetition through generations. A local physician, summoned once when one of the children fell ill with fever, quietly noted that their conditions resembled congenital disorders he had seen in medical texts but rarely in practice. He whispered to a trusted friend that such illnesses often arose from marriages between close relatives. The rumor spread discreetly, traveling from one saloon to another, softened by cautious words but heavy with implication. Documents, too, began to surface. An old ledger kept at the county clerk's office listed marriages from decades past, and in more than one entry, the bride and groom shared the same surname. A pattern emerged: brothers marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces. The records were sparse and incomplete, but they painted enough of a picture to raise suspicion. As whispers turned into quiet conversations, neighbors began to recall incidents that seemed insignificant at the time. One man remembered being turned away at the door when offering help during a harsh winter, the father insisting that no one from outside was welcome. A woman recalled that years earlier, she had noticed a young girl on the ranch who disappeared soon after, no explanation ever given. Others noted that births were never celebrated openly, as though joy itself had been replaced with secrecy. For the investigator or storyteller, it became impossible to dismiss these threads as coincidence. The family's physical isolation now seemed purposeful, as if it were not just geography that kept them apart, but shame. The children's illnesses, the identical features, the evasive behavior of the parents, all pointed toward something unspoken yet undeniable. By this point, the suspicion of inbreeding had grown strong enough to unsettle even those who usually avoided gossip. It was not merely a matter of poor health or bad luck. It was a reflection of choices made in defiance of social norms, choices that had trapped generations in a cycle of suffering. The atmosphere around the family grew heavier. Each visit to their home felt like walking into a place where every smile was forced, every word guarded, and every gesture meant to deflect attention. What lay behind the closed doors of that house remained unseen, but the weight of silence suggested truths too disturbing to reveal. And yet, the more they tried to hide, the clearer it became that something terrible was waiting to be uncovered. When questions grew sharper and suspicions harder to ignore, the family's resistance became clear. Conversations that once ended in polite silence now carried a sharper edge. The father, who had always been withdrawn, grew visibly tense whenever outsiders pressed too close. His words, though few, carried a warning tone, firm, final, and unwilling to entertain further inquiry. The mother, though softer in demeanor, echoed this stance through avoidance. She would change subjects, excuse herself abruptly, or simply refuse to answer questions that touched upon her children's health or the family's past. Neighbors who attempted to probe deeper faced subtle but unmistakable hostility. One rancher recalled visiting with the excuse of offering extra feed during a dry season, only to find himself shut out at the door. Another remembered the father's icy stare when the church minister encouraged the family to bring their children to Sunday service, promising prayers for their health. That invitation was never accepted. Local authorities, too, found themselves at an impasse. In a town as rough as Dodge City, where saloon fights and cattle theft often consumed the sheriff's attention, the quiet suffering of a reclusive family did not demand urgent action. The law had no grounds to interfere with marriages or child-rearing so long as no crime could be proven. And in a society where family matters were considered sacred and private, few were willing to risk confrontation. This resistance only deepened the atmosphere of unease. Every attempt to pierce the veil of secrecy seemed to push the truth further out of reach. The children were kept close to home, rarely seen in town. When they did appear, they were quiet, their heads lowered, their physical difficulties impossible to hide. Yet if anyone tried to offer sympathy or help, the family withdrew immediately, as if kindness itself threatened to expose them. The tension became a constant undercurrent in the community. People wanted answers, but hesitated to push too hard, fearing both social backlash and moral ambiguity. After all, who was to say how far one could intrude into another family's private life? And yet, as the children grew weaker, as their resemblance to one another became uncanny, the line between privacy and silent complicity grew thinner. For those who sought the truth, the obstacles felt suffocating. Every path forward was blocked by silence, by fear, by a society that preferred to look away. And so the ranch stood, quiet on the prairie, its walls holding secrets that no one dared fully confront. The deeper the resistance, the greater the sense that something horrific lay just beyond reach, hidden not by accident, but by deliberate choice. It was not until voices from outside the household began to speak that the fragments of suspicion turned into something more tangible. A neighbor who had lived on the prairie since the 1850s finally broke years of silence. She recalled a young girl from the family, barely in her teens, who vanished without explanation. The story had always troubled her, but she admitted that most in town chose not to question it. Now, as the twins' condition stirred whispers anew, her memory carried more weight. She was there one summer, the woman said, and gone by the next. No grave, no farewell, just silence. Other testimonies followed. A minister, long retired, revealed that decades earlier he had tried to convince the family to allow a proper baptism for their children. They refused, offering no reason other than it is family business. To him, their secrecy was not merely odd, it was deliberate. His words, spoken years later, echoed like an accusation. They kept their children hidden, as though the world itself was not meant to see them. Medical evidence also began to surface. A tattered notebook belonging to a traveling doctor was discovered in the county archives. Among notes on common ailments, fevers, broken bones, childbirth complications, there was a page devoted entirely to a family outside Dodge City. He had written of children born with weak constitutions, shared defects, and uncommon similarity in features. His conclusion was stark, though veiled in the cautious language of the time. The conditions, he suspected, were the result of close relations between parents. Diaries from townsfolk added further shadows to the story. One entry, written by a local storekeeper, described seeing the family's eldest son, years earlier, escorting a girl into town whom he introduced as his wife. The storekeeper noted that she looked strikingly like his younger sister. He had dismissed it as coincidence, but in hindsight, the memory felt far darker. Piece by piece, the testimonies and documents formed a clearer picture. What had once been rumor now took on the weight of evidence. The family's secrecy, their resistance to outside contact, the uncanny resemblance among the children, all of it pointed to a truth few dared to speak aloud, that the lineage of the family had folded in upon itself, generation after generation, until illness and deformity became unavoidable. For the first time, the community's whispers gained structure. The fragments of memory, the scribbled notes, and the reluctant confessions did not stand alone. They reinforced one another. And as these revelations spread, the unease in Dodge City turned into something heavier. What had been hidden behind the walls of a quiet ranch now threatened to spill into public view, exposing a story too disturbing for the town to ignore any longer. The rumors, the fragments of testimony, and the scattered documents all built toward a moment when speculation could no longer remain in the shadows. That moment arrived with a testimony that left little room for doubt. It came from a former ranch hand, an aging man who, after decades of silence, finally spoke. He revealed that as a young boy hired to mend fences and tend cattle, he had lived briefly on the property. What he witnessed haunted him for the rest of his life. He recalled evenings when, instead of the lively chatter common in frontier households, the family home was steeped in silence. Behind closed doors, he overheard arguments, not about money or work, but about marriages arranged between cousins, unions that defied both church and law. He described, with trembling words, how one of the older sons was promised to a girl barely of age, his own kin. The man's voice cracked when he admitted why he had left the ranch so suddenly. "I could not bear to see children born into such misery, knowing the sickness in their blood was no accident." This testimony aligned with physical evidence that could no longer be dismissed. Records of births in the county office, though sparse, showed overlapping surnames. When paired with the physician's old notes and the striking resemblance among the children, the conclusion became undeniable. The illnesses and deformities suffered by the twins and by their older siblings before them were not the work of chance. They were the inevitable result of a closed circle of marriages repeated through generations. The most devastating revelation came when the mother herself, pressed by illness and weary of carrying the burden, admitted fragments of truth. In a hushed confession to a neighbor she trusted, she spoke of being married young to a man within her own family. She expressed no anger, only resignation, saying it had been the way of things for as long as she could remember. Her words were not an attempt to justify, but a reflection of a cycle too deeply ingrained to resist. With this confession, the whispered suspicions turned into a confirmed horror. The children's suffering was no longer a tragic mystery. It was the living evidence of choices made in secrecy and sustained by silence. The truth struck Dodge City harder than any gunfight on Front Street, for it revealed not the violence of outlaws, but the quiet devastation hidden in the heart of a family that chose secrecy over survival. The revelation shocked the town. Conversations that had been carried in whispers now erupted openly. The weight of the truth could not be ignored. The family's suffering was not only their own, but also a reflection of a community that had looked away for too long. When the revelations could no longer be denied, Dodge City was forced to confront a truth it had long ignored. At first, the reaction was one of stunned silence. The saloons, usually filled with noise and bravado, turned somber as the story spread. Men who prided themselves on frontier toughness shook their heads in disbelief, while women whispered with equal parts sorrow and outrage. For a community that had tolerated gunfights in the street and lawlessness on the cattle trails, this scandal cut much deeper. It was not about outlaws or violence. It was about family, morality, and a betrayal of the most intimate bonds. Authorities, pushed by the rising public outrage, began to investigate. The sheriff, reluctant at first, had no choice but to act once testimonies and records aligned. Witnesses were summoned, documents examined, and the family brought under questioning. Yet even as evidence mounted, the legal system faltered. In the 1870s, laws against incest were vague and rarely enforced on the frontier. Marriage records were incomplete, births often unregistered, and without modern science like DNA, much depended on testimony and circumstantial proof. The father was accused of arranging unlawful unions, but no formal charges of abuse could be secured. The mother's quiet confession, spoken in confidence to a neighbor, was dismissed as hearsay in court. The ranch hand's testimony, though powerful, was criticized for being decades old and difficult to verify. In the end, the law punished the family not with prison sentences, but with public shame. They were ostracized, avoided in town, their children pointed at with pity or cruelty. Business with them dried up, and the ranch began to wither under the weight of isolation. The church reacted with equal parts condemnation and regret. Ministers denounced the family's choices from the pulpit, framing the scandal as a warning about the dangers of straying from God's law. But many parishioners could not escape the uncomfortable truth. They had seen signs for years and done nothing. Neighbors admitted in hushed conversations that they had looked away out of fear of confrontation. The scandal became a mirror, forcing the town to reckon with its own silence. For the children, however, there was no justice. Their illnesses remained, their futures clouded by the stigma of their origins. Some townsfolk tried to show kindness, offering food or help, but others treated them as cursed, unworthy of sympathy. The tragedy of the twins and their siblings lay not only in the genetic consequences of their parents' choices, but also in the failure of a society that allowed secrecy to fester into catastrophe. In the end, the case left Dodge City shaken but unchanged in law. No sweeping reforms were enacted, no new protections introduced. The family's downfall was treated as an isolated disgrace rather than a systemic failure. Yet the story lingered, passed from one generation to the next as a grim reminder of what can happen when silence becomes complicity, and when shame becomes stronger than the truth. In the years that followed, the family's ranch grew quieter, as if the land itself carried the weight of their secrets. The father aged quickly, worn down not only by the hardships of farm life, but also by the burden of public scorn. He withdrew almost entirely, rarely seen in town, his pride broken by whispers that never ceased. The mother, frail and sickly, carried on in silence, caring for the children with a quiet resignation that seemed to accept tragedy as inevitable. The twins, whose birth had first drawn the attention of Dodge City, struggled through childhood with illnesses that never fully loosened their grip. Frailty, constant fevers, and physical deformities marked their lives. Neighbors recalled seeing them only occasionally, thin figures peeking through a doorway or leaning weakly against their mother's side. Their existence was a painful reminder of the choices that had been made long before they were born. As the years passed, some of the older children left the ranch, trying to find a life away from the shadow of shame. A few disappeared entirely, swallowed by the anonymity of distant towns. Others carried the same weaknesses, making it difficult to survive in a world that demanded physical strength and resilience. For them, escape was not freedom, it was exile. The scandal did not spark new laws or sweeping change in Dodge City. Life on the frontier moved on, focused on cattle drives, trade, and survival. Yet the memory of the family remained etched in local history. Older townsfolk spoke of it as a cautionary tale, one that highlighted not only the dangers of isolation, but also the consequences of silence. Parents warned their children never to hide wrongdoing, reminding them that secrets, no matter how deeply buried, eventually come to light. Some ministers used the story as a sermon illustration, pointing to the family's downfall as an example of moral decay when communities turn inward instead of outward. Others reflected more quietly, acknowledging that society itself had failed. Neighbors had seen signs, strange illnesses, vanishing children, uncanny resemblances, and yet chose to look away. The tragedy was not only born of the family's decisions, but also of a community unwilling to confront what it knew in its heart to be wrong. In the end, the legacy of the twins and their family was one of sorrow and warning. It revealed the fragility of human life when trapped in cycles of secrecy, the dangers of shame that silences truth, and the devastating cost of traditions that go unquestioned. Their story remains a haunting reminder that isolation, when left unchecked, can breed not only loneliness but destruction. And so, as Dodge City grew into a symbol of the Old West, of lawmen, outlaws, and frontier courage, it also carried within its history a quieter, darker story. A story of a family undone not by violence or poverty alone, but by the secrets it kept and the silence of those who looked away.